Welcome to the Mason Dukacek Show. And before we jump in, this episode is brought to you by WorkforceAlchemy.com, helping leaders uncover hidden profit leaks inside their workforce. Today's guest is Logan Yonavjak. She's the CEO of Founder Readiness Institute, and she is redefining how investors and companies evaluate leadership under pressure by focusing on readiness instead of resumes. With 2 decades of directing capital into impact-driven ventures and advanced degrees from Yale, Logan brings deep experience in finance, sustainability, and founder development. Her work is changing how capital allocators, executives, and basically how they assess leadership potential before the stakes get high. Logan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mason. That was an amazing intro. I think you've done the best I've heard so far. You can be my spokesperson from going
Well,
forward.
I did my homework.
That's
This is
great.
something I take pride in doing and learning about the people that are going to be on so that I can ask the best questions and get the most value out of the time we have, not only for myself, but for everyone listening. So super glad to have you.
Awesome.
So what first led you to focus on leadership readiness instead of traditional metrics like market size or product strength when evaluating startup success?
Well, I'll tell a bit of my career story because I think that's always illuminating in terms of how I ended up here and starting this company. I started my career interested in the investment world because I saw that where we put our money and where we invest our money is really obviously incredibly material in terms of seeing innovation and progress in our society. I have an impact oriented lens, so I care a lot about nature and people and community based investment. So I spent the majority of my career just figuring out ways to allocate capital. I worked at private equity firms, university endowments, early stage investing firms. I've started my own company one other time. And all along the way, I just recognized the power of leadership and teams in actually executing on impact and just how many teams are dysfunctional. Many leaders are not necessarily ready for the roles that they're undertaking. And with some kind of natural interest in leadership assessments and psychology, I had this idea of like, can we measure markers of readiness in leaders to really assess whether they're prepared for more complex roles, higher pressure roles? And I hadn't seen anything quite like what we've developed in the market. So I approached my co-founder, who's a psychologist and data scientist. He also has an MBA, and we joined forces to create our platform, the Readiness Engine.
So what are some of those markers?
So we look at 6 core dimensions, although there's others we can look at. We found through the research that these are kind of the 6 areas, we call them constructs, areas that are most likely to have significant positive impact in a startup environment, meaning like companies whose leaders have had these capacities at higher levels have gone on to raise follow-on funds, to have exits, to have successful business outcomes. And some of them include coachability. That's a main driver. Purposeful agility is the ability to pivot while holding a mission, but pivot quickly. And we have strategic complexity. What that means is how good are you at holding multiple concepts at once objectively? So we have, those are kind of 3 of the 6. I can go into all of them if you like,
Yeah,
but
just go ahead. Might as well tell us what the other
okay.
ones are.
Resilience under fire is how resilient are you when the pressure hits? Like when you have a lot of outside stress, how do you behave and how do you react to that pressure? And then we have our relational and emotional intelligence. Just how do you relate to others with empathy? How do you build trust and rapport? What's your network building capacity? And then team climate IQ is your ability to create a flow state on teams so that people are optimized to work in their best. It's creating psychological safety and a sense of a positive flow state environment for your team.
It's funny you say those because when you said the one about resilience under pressure, that reminds me of when I was growing up, one of my parents' good friends, his name was Gene Mason. He passed away several years ago, but he was somewhat of a mogul in the newspaper industry in small towns. I think he ran about 30 of them or ran them. And he had incredible resilience under pressure. And we had Thanksgiving with him every year. So I always looked forward to it, even as a kid growing up, because
Wow.
I would listen to his stories about what was going on in business, and I was fascinated by the stories he told. I remember one time he was talking about how everyone in the office was panicking. Oh, like the world was on fire. Oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? And everyone's panicking, freaking out. Uh, he just calmly said, "Hey, I'm gonna go play some golf. It's Friday afternoon. I'm gonna go play some golf, and we'll see you Monday." And everyone was like, freaking out. What? He goes, that's just business.
Hmm.
I'll think about it over the weekend, and when we come back on Monday, we'll fix it, and no big deal." And then the entire room reset,
Yeah.
calibrated, calm, and guess what? He went out, he played golf, he enjoyed his weekend, he showed up Monday, went to work, figured out the solution, got it done. Next, no big deal. So,
Yeah.
and that's just one of the 6 dimensions, but I remember being fascinated by that story, and the thing that fascinated me was how everyone reacted once they saw how he reacted.
People are attuned to their leaders, and so that's a very powerful story. I think that a good leader has the ability to command people's nervous systems in a way. That's really what we're talking about, is whether someone's in a sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system state. And when you're in a sympathetic nervous system state, which is fight or flight or freeze, it's much more difficult to learn anything new or to make decisions from your prefrontal cortex. Essentially, your executive function shuts down because you're in this state of duress. And so a leader who's able to create a sense of psychological safety, really it's nervous system safety, is able to enable people to think more creatively and to find problem solving abilities within that context.
And he was battle tested. I mean, he was a battle test executive that had weathered many storms, and what looked like a big deal to everyone else to him was like, no big deal. I got this. See you Monday. It's like you talk about, there's different levels of capacity that some of these leaders have. And his was
Right.
extremely high. I loved spending time with him. So, can you share a defining moment in your career that changed how you think about leadership and capital allocation?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's multiple, of course, but in I had a company before this. It was my first company I co-founded, and it was an example of the investor that we brought on to our team to capitalize the company initially was his leadership style was a bit misaligned with our intent as a business, and we kind of took on the investment because we needed capital and we found enough alignment with him initially, but we found over time that he was putting a lot of pressure on us for a very high return for his own, his own return as an investor versus thinking more holistically about where we're headed as a company and how long it could take to really set the foundation of a company up for success initially. So I think it was an example of me not necessarily paying attention to my gut instinct initially about like the values alignment of our different visions for the capital return and the timeline we needed to actually build something meaningful and resilient as a company. So it was an example of like lip service to values, but not actually like living those values at the end of the day. And so I think that was really difficult for me because I put my heart and soul into that company. And it just unfortunately was not, who you go into bed with in terms of a capital and investor perspective is instrumental in how your company ends up operating. So
So, don't leave me with a cliffhanger here. How did that turn out?
the company ended up getting assumed by his family office, so it's still going, but it's no longer like a standalone enterprise.
Okay. So, investors often say that they invest in teams as much as ideas. What are they still getting wrong in how they evaluate teams?
Well, so I think a lot of people are okay. So the way I like to think about this is it's the skill of reading people is a bell curve like anything else in most skills. A lot of people are mediocre at it. Some people are really good at it and some people are really bad at it. And I think a lot of people overestimate their ability to read a person using their gut feeling and their intuition. They have their own biases, they have their own patterns that they're bringing in that they don't even realize are influencing their decision making. So there's things like the halo effect or confirmation bias where, a founder might have come from like a popular accelerator or they went to a certain school, and no matter what they say, you're like, oh, this person's impressive. Those are just the kinds of biases people bring to the table. So there's this kind of like, oh, I'm better at reading people than other people bias that I've seen. The other layer is when assessment tools are used, it's often just personality tests. So it's just testing like someone's preferences and maybe communication style, but it's not getting at this readiness or capacity piece. Like, how are they going to really operate under pressure with complexity, which is what we're measuring. And then I think just honing in like on a few skills. Sometimes people hire based on past performance or like a resume or a warm reference, but they don't really dig into, again, this capacity or readiness component.
So, can you walk us through a real example where assessing founder readiness meaningfully changed an investment decision or company outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like multiple lenses in terms of outcomes or KPIs that we can look at. Um, we're both useful on the promotional hiring and also the promotional piece and also the hiring decisions. So on the promotional side, we've got, in a general middle market company, you've got about 40% of the executive promotions are not sufficient within the first 18 months. They're identified as not being sufficient in terms of the execution of that function. And that's costing companies like we've estimated about $270,000 per executive if you take the base salary and 1.5x it. And so what we can do is come in and provide a readiness score along these 6 dimensions, which can then articulate, where you're likely going to see breakdowns in that individual. So for instance, if someone is low on their coachability score, they're probably not going to take in a lot of feedback or information about their performance. And they're likely going to be very defensive about affecting change within themselves and their behaviors. So if you see that in someone, they might not be ready for that next promotional role. They might not be ready to step in that next level of leadership. So those are the kinds of scenarios that we are intervening in.
So, if someone's very high in coachability, that might make up for a few deficiencies in other areas. If all else being equal, if they're deficient in one or two areas, if they're highly coachable, as someone who would invest in that company or think about hiring them for that role, am I wrong to assume that I might be able to take some comfort in the fact that they may not be ready yet, but they're coachable and could be ready in a shorter window of time?
I think coachability is one of the most central dimensions of a leadership capacity because if you're willing to be flexible in how you identify with outside feedback, then you're a lot more likely to listen to customers, to listen to outside stakeholders, to make changes when necessary. When your teammates, even if you get like a 360 review, you're probably going to adopt some of those feedback mechanisms. So yes, I absolutely think that coachability is like a central component of improving your developmental abilities.
Is there any of them that's just an absolute red flag that if they just tank this one dimension, that you need to move on?
I mean, I would argue that lower is not necessarily bad. I think it depends on the function that you're hiring someone for. So, for instance, at a level we go from 1 to 6. At a level 3, often people are in their strategic complexity, which is one of the dimensions. People are often very focused on execution and very directed. So those people are often really good in early startup roles because you have to execute, execute, execute. And you're just like basically finding ways that you can achieve goals and just test things out quickly. And so you're not necessarily needing to kind of sit back and hold like 20 different perspectives in the same way that you would in a later stage company where things get a lot more complex in certain other ways where you need to hold that objectivity. And so it depends on kind of like role that you're hiring someone for, where they need to sit in the developmental pattern. But in terms
Nice.
of what I think is something that would be like a no-go, in my opinion, is the coachability. I feel like if someone's not willing to take feedback, it's indicative and systematic of a lot of other things in their capacity. So I would say that would be the biggest flag from my perspective and experience.
I'm sitting here thinking about stripping things down to the most basic level. it sounds to me like being able to measure coachability by itself. I don't even know how much your assessment costs or whatever, but to me, if that's a deal killer, it's probably an absolute no brainer just to measure even that one trait, everything else being a bonus.
Well, we do have a coachability micro score
Okay. I was
for
curious.
that reason, because it's just like a quick, yeah, learn your coachability score so you can get. Some people use that in hiring in particular, it just to get a sense of somebody's coachability. Because investors writ large, if I ask them, which of these constructs do you care about most? They say coachability.
So I'm kind of hung up on this readiness under pressure concept. So how do you define readiness under pressure and how is it different or how does it compare to traits like grit or resilience?
Well, I think a lot of times people assume that grit is in my opinion like an unstrategic, unrelenting
Durability, maybe.
ability. But it's unrelenting in a not necessarily in a strategic way. It's like, I'm just gonna hammer and hammer and hammer until I find a way through this. And that's useful maybe in some very specific instances. You do it for a spurt, but you don't want that to be your dominating way of getting through things. There needs to be a holistic kind of approach where you might push hard in one area and then pull back when you need to, or you might need to pivot and recognize that you need to pivot sooner instead of just continuing to like push and push and push. And I think there's this misconception that grit is like what startup founders should focus on. And that often leads to burnout. We see 65% of companies failing. This is a Harvard Business Review stat because of internal problems. And that includes burnout of founders and founding teams. And I think a lot of that burnout comes from this culture of grit, like just keep going no matter what and never take a break and don't do any self-care and don't learn how to breathe and do meditation practice or work out or whatever it is that you need to like reset your nervous system so that you're not just going as hard as you can all the time.
So what are the most common blind spots that you see founders and CEOs carry into high stakes decisions or situations?
Well, yeah, again, it depends on the level that they're at. I think one of the things we see is individuals sometimes as they move up the developmental levels, they will become more aware of more complexity in the system. So they might want to take in more feedback and more stakeholder input and kind of hold space for that. And they learn to be more relational and more relational in like how they want to take in that feedback. But sometimes that can it almost causes like a freeze of, oh, I have so much information and input now. I don't know what to do with it. So there's this break point of like, wow, I see so much more of the system. I'm able to hold all these pieces, but I don't know where to go next. And so that ability to pivot can sometimes get stalled out at certain levels of development.
So as companies scale, leaders often struggle to scale themselves. What patterns do you see most frequently?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that so we'll talk about the resilience piece. I think as one starter in the beginning of starting a company, for instance, or maybe starting a new role, you have a lot of energy for it. And there are ways of working that have worked for you in the past. Potentially that's how you got where you are. You have a lot of like momentum and grit, if you will. And then as the stress starts mounting and as a lot of different external factors are coming at you, you don't have the systems in place internally to actually hold that stress. So difficult behaviors start showing up. You might get angry or irritated at people more often. You might just feel like you can't make a decision because you're mentally just so burned out. You haven't like created ways in which you know how to work with your nervous system to de-stress and to create space for extra stress coming in. And so you have to create patterns and systems in order to create resiliency within your own emotional landscape. And so people just often don't practice those, even if it's just breathing techniques or walking meditation, anything of that nature. So the pressure starts mounting and then their nervous system literally can't take it anymore.
It makes me think of Tony Robbins, how he talks about being in or out of a peak state, like just your ability to manage a peak state, huge. So what are some early warning signs that CEOs should look for that might indicate that their leadership capacity needs some strengthening before a crisis hits?
In terms of just them themselves being a person internally aware.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some more universal markers and then everyone's different. But in terms of the universal markers, like, you notice people starting to, again, I like to think about it from a nervous system perspective because you start feeling more, and this is a somatic awareness piece, but like you start just feeling more intensity and stress in your body. Like that, those are markers. You start getting more irritated or little tasks feel overwhelming. You start to see that it's harder to think long term and strategically. You're just always dealing with what's in front of you and feeling like you're always putting out fires. Those are signals that you haven't really created the systems to manage all of the complexity that you're dealing with. And so there's going to start, there's like early warning signs from like the body and the emotional body and the mental body. And then there's also usually you're making less effective decisions and people can start to pick up on that. So
Okay.
those are just some of them.
So any tips on external signals, like the way people react in meetings or the way they interact with you or what they do after interactions with you that might tip someone's hand that, hey, you know what, I might need to develop a little bit more here, or I might need to develop a little bit more there.
This all comes down to what systems have you put into place to get that feedback from your colleagues? Like, how comfortable are they? And this is the psychological safety piece. Like, how comfortable is someone in approaching you and saying, hey, like, I've noticed you've been irritable recently, or you kind of didn't do a great job with that call with your client, or that email was a little curt. Like, it just sort of depends on, again, back to the coachability and back to the team climate IQ. How comfortable and psychologically safe have you created your team so that they can give you that feedback, and how willing are you to hear it?
So you've spoken about listening as a critical leadership signal. What does strong listening look like in practice, and how does it translate into measurable performance?
Well, I think a lot of what listening is taking your attention from yourself and literally putting it on the person that you're talking to. So it's an actual shift in where your attention is sitting. And I think people can sense that when you're really listening to them. There's actually a group called the Presencing Institute, which has like 4 different dimensions of listening. It's worth getting into a little bit more. But at the 4th level, which is like the deepest level of listening, you're actually creating what they call generative listening, which is you're listening to the system, not just the person you're talking to, but the system itself that you're both involved, like the field that you're both engaged in, and you're letting whatever needs to come into the field, and you're sharing that openly. And so it's literally like you're creating a bubble between you two, or whoever's involved in the conversation. And it's like everyone's letting what needs to come in without judgment into the conversation. And so there's like many depths to listening. I think most people probably only stay in the as much as I need to hear before I can talk mode. And that's sort of like early stages of listening, where you kind of like you can experience it as you're having a conversation with someone. You can feel that they're just waiting to say their next piece.
That was some very valuable wisdom for anyone who's watching or listening. If anyone watching or listening takes away nothing from this entire session other than that, it was worth their time. So you touched on this a little bit earlier. I want to kind of circle back to, you talked a little bit about cognitive biases. So how do cognitive biases influence how boards and investors evaluate founders, and how can leaders guard against those biases?
I actually just wrote an article about this because I'm really passionate about how AI can actually do a better job in some ways of looking at patterns in someone's behavior and a leadership capacity than humans can because of this bias, some of the biases. But so one thing that comes up a lot in how investors make decisions about founders is people who talk a lot often get more, they're often given a higher degree of confidence if they're verbose. So someone who speaks a lot and speaks fast can often convey that they are going to be a better leader, although that's not necessarily the case because they might not be a good listener, for instance. So I think people get persuaded when someone's really verbose and they say a lot of things. There's also just the charisma piece, people who are charismatic and who are good with mirroring other people. There's this mirror effect where some people are much better at sensing the other person's emotional state and kind of like matching their demeanor to that person's state. So if you're not aware that that's happening as much, you might like just think, oh, this person's great. They're going to do a great job. I really like them. And that's because they're kind of acting like you. So what AI can do in this, for instance, in the transcript analysis is we actually have a way that we can take out the verbosity piece. And obviously the tech is not picking up on charisma because it's transcript analysis. So those are just two examples of ways that we're kind of removing bias.
That's very, very fascinating and very, very important. And I don't think you can stress enough how important that when people say, oh, I really like them for whatever
Yeah,
bias it is. I have been in part of assessment discussions where assessment results, an executive or a business owner sitting there with assessment results saying what this job requires is not what this person brings to the job and why. And it's very specific and very detailed. And there's a long list of reasons. And the manager who did the interview is like, but I really like them. I really like them. And it's just like they're the intensity of how much that hiring manager liked somebody
right.
is supposed to outweigh all of the evidence that is right in front of their face, specific, grounded reasons why this will be a disaster. But the intensity of how much that hiring manager likes the person for companies that don't know any better. Okay, well, if you really like them, we'll just go ahead and do that. And then they wonder why they churn and burn, or worse, that person who is an absolute misfit stays around forever and makes everyone else as miserable and distracted as they are.
I know, and that's an unfortunate piece. I think that's where companies need to have better procedures around how they make hiring decisions so that that person doesn't just carry all the weight in terms of who gets hired. But yeah, there's all these different layers of decision making that obviously an assessment alone is not going to solve all of our promotion and hiring decisions
No, of course not.
issues.
But it can very easily counterbalance the biases that you're talking about as exemplified by someone saying, but I really, really like them. So I'm with you on that. So out of curiosity, what has surprised you the most after assessing leadership across all these different industries and ecosystems? What's been your biggest surprise?
I think the biggest surprise is that there's still a lot of people out there who think, it's like early adopters of any technology. There's some people I've run into that are just so eager to have more data and see this as a valuable dimension of making better decisions and having better people outcomes. And then there's still just a large portion of corporates and early stage VCs, or I shouldn't say early stage VCs and folks in the financial services industry that have literally said versions of, even if I had this information, I probably wouldn't use it. And I think that alone is valuable information. Like, I think people out there should ask if they're investors or if they work for a company, like ask if they're using any assessment tools. I think it says a lot about the leadership and the culture of a place if they're willing to administer or people are willing to take these. Not saying necessarily just ours. I want to know if someone's afraid to take or refuses to take something like this. I think it says a lot about them as a person and how coachable they are and where their mindset is. So that's kind of been one of the most surprising things, that people don't always make logical decisions and that there's all these hangups people have about learning about themselves or having information about what they might perceive as a delicate or area of just learning about themselves in general or people they work with. I don't totally understand it, but it's come up quite a bit.
I've had that same observation and feel very much the same as you do. Knowing what I know, if I were an applicant and I go to a company who is assessing and taking the time to do a thorough process as opposed to hiring and hoping, I would feel much more confident that my career is on the right path if I do get
Yeah.
selected for that job, because I don't want to be put into a role that I don't fit. And if this company has taken the time to identify what does it take to be successful, not good, but what does it take to be a superstar in this role? And they're very thorough in gathering as much job-related information as they can before they make a decision. Then if they make the decision to bring me on, then I feel very, very comfortable about
Been rigorous. Yeah, you've been
moving
rigorously
my
steps.
family and
Yeah.
doing something different and charting a different course and adjusting my career along a path that I feel a much greater sense of certainty is a good move, not based on, hey, we had a couple conversations and they liked my resume, so they offered me a job. That's a big difference. My confidence level that I'm going to succeed in a company that I don't want to use the word, well, that might be haphazard in their hiring processes or negligent in their hiring processes doesn't make me feel confident as an applicant that that's someplace that I want to go and have success.
Right.
In comparison or contrast to an organization says, hey, we know exactly what this job requires. We know exactly what traits and characteristics and dimensions are important in someone who can succeed well in this specific position. And oh, by the way, you match them perfectly. Welcome aboard. That's a way different feeling going on board to a company like that than, yeah, we talked about golf and and the guy went to college where I went and
Yeah,
they were
that's what you get it. I mean, to me, it's just so obvious that, well, and something else I tell people is that you're being judged either way. Like, I would like to know under what criteria I'm being judged rather than just meeting a person and them saying, "Oh gosh, it's really cool that you grew up in Georgia and that we went to this school together." Like, to me, I would rather know, okay, these are at least the criteria that were set out and I didn't meet 5 of them versus who knows, but they're still judging you. That's what I think is interesting. We're all still being judged by each other. It's just how formalized is it, right?
So, if there was only one piece of advice that you could give to anyone watching or listening today, what would it be and why?
It would be that we're under one of the most intense disruptive periods in at least white collar workforce history. In my opinion, this AI revolution really is disrupting at such a speed that um is dizzying. I think there's a lot of fear out there about how it's going to shake out. And one of the things that people can do, whether they're executives, whether they're going out into the job market for the first time, is understanding their capacity for complexity and how to deal with pressure. I think that if you can demonstrate some of the core competencies and markers that we're looking for, you're much better equipped to find a role and to really know how to pivot when you need to, how to take in strategic information, how to be emotionally resilient. I mean, these are all things that I think are overlooked often as soft skills. But in this era, you really have to be ready to take in a lot more complexity and pressure than we've had in kind of past generations. And so I think that if you invest in yourself and understanding some of these dimensions of yourself, you'll be in a lot better position.
So, if people listening want to know more about you, your company, and the work you do, what are the best ways for them to connect?
Yeah. Always reach out to me at Logan at founderrl.com or founderready.io is our website.
Cool. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you and hope we can get together and do this again sometime soon.
Thank you, Mason.